There's something just undeniable about the glistening skyscrapers built in the early 20th century. I can't help but wonder why we ever stopped building like this in favor of the glass boxes today, and also what it would look like to bring Deco back. My name is Chris Hytha. I have a degree in architecture. For the past 3 years, I've basically dedicated my life to documenting the beautiful details you can find on top of these buildings, and I've had a ton of time to understand why they captivate me so much. The first question I needed answered was, how did these buildings even come to be? And really, it's a confluence of several factors that created this perfect storm for an incredible architectural typology. First, the invention of the elevator, right? That's what enabled buildings to rise taller and taller and taller and become skyscrapers. And in the late 1800s, buildings began to get taller, but they still looked very familiar to people of that time because they were clad with the same Beaux-Arts or Greek-inspired ornamentation that was common on smaller buildings. Next, we have the prosperity that came along with the 1920s. It was post-World War I, and the economy was booming, so we built. The third factor here starts in Chicago. There was a design competition for the new headquarters of the Chicago Tribune building, and the winning entry was much of the same, going back to old architectural languages, and it's this Gothic-inspired skyscraper. But it wasn't the winning entry that would spark this Art Deco movement. It was actually the runner-up by an architect named Emil Saarinen. And while his proposal was never built, it started a whole new wave of thinking for what skyscrapers could be. And then we started getting skyscrapers that looked like this. It's the American Radiator Building by Raymond Hood in New York City, finished in 1924, and it's starting to look a little bit different than something like that Gothic entry that won the Tribune contest. In many ways, our built environment tends to reflect the culture of the day, and this new style that these architects were exploring perfectly encapsulates the energy and excitement and exuberance that came with the 1920s. Think of flappers and early Hollywood, and we get this building in Los Angeles called the Eastern Columbia Building that has this vibrant blue terracotta facade with gold details. The building is not afraid to express itself with these bright colors. And interestingly, the architect said this building was inspired by the blue water of the California coast. So we're getting all these interesting influences into the skyscrapers we were building. Many of these buildings had some growing pains as they had to adapt and change use. Some of them have sat abandoned, like the Starrick building in Memphis, which has just loomed over the city skyline for nearly 30 years, but now it's being revitalized as a residential property. And many others, like in my home city here in Philadelphia, the Architects Building has been converted into boutique hotels. And there are many examples also of these buildings turning into residences, like the Kansas City Power and Light Building in Kansas City, Missouri. A question that I keep going back to is, what's the deal with ornamentation? If you're not familiar, ornamentation just means the details that are added onto the building. They're not essential to its function or its use. They're just there to make it look pretty. By looking at today's architecture, you can clearly see that we don't seem to value ornamentation anymore. And these types of details would be the first thing cut out of any budget so developers can save money. But there's something about these beautiful old buildings that resonates with me deeply, so I tried to create some rationale of why we might consider bringing back some ornamentation. The longer I live, the more I see how integrated storytelling is to really just humanity as a whole. I mean, going back to like cave paintings and telling the story of some hunt with some stick figures carved into the wall and some crude animal. And YouTube, the platform we're on right now, it's just people telling stories to satisfy that deep need we have. And I think one of the biggest values of this ornamentation is storytelling. One of my favorite motifs of buildings from this era is the inclusion of bald eagles. I've seen more than I can count across the entire USA, and it tells this beautiful story of patriotism in the United States during this time of wealth that unfortunately was cut short when the Great Depression kind of ruined everything. Another example is the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. This was built as the headquarters of a clinic, and to pay homage to the nurses that helped build this clinic, they're actually memorialized in stone at the top of the building. Now looking at the Louisiana State Capitol in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, the building actually includes carvings of local flora and fauna to really connect it back to the state in which it's representing. And a final example is the AIU Citadel, also known as Levesque Tower in Columbus, Ohio, a really beautiful building. And it was originally built as the headquarters for an insurance company, so they included these guardian angels carved into the corners of the building. In contrast to these examples, you can really start to see how the modern glass towers feel like they can be just picked up and dropped in any city across the country and it wouldn't look out of place. But these old Art Deco buildings are telling stories about the companies that created them or the landscapes that surround them, and each is one of a kind, becoming iconic to a place. I really like the analogy to fashion when thinking about ornamentation. Sure, we could all just wear uniforms or boring suits, but no, we're humans and we like to express ourselves and wear jewelry or funky clothing. When I look at these buildings adorned with carved stone and cast terracotta and beautiful colors, I just see the humanity in the designers that created them. The next big question is, why did we stop? The first piece of this is the Great Depression, right? The exuberance of the 20s couldn't last forever, and then we simply didn't have the money to do this anymore. And also labor became much more expensive. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing because it means unions and fair wages and safe practices so people aren't dying every time we build skyscrapers. So it's a good cultural change, but it means the loss of this craftsmanship. Along with the added cost, we had a change in style. Architecture is no different than seasonal fashion, but the time frame is a little bit longer as we shift our taste in what type of architecture we like. So there really weren't a lot of skyscrapers being built after the Great Depression and World War II. It wasn't really until the 50s and 60s that another building boom happened, but by then we had entirely abandoned Deco in favor of the school of modernism. Bauhaus, Le Corbusier, these incredible architects that entirely changed how we think about buildings. And just like I was taught in school, they said, ornamentation, that's just fluff, that's just extra. It's not inherent to the building, it's not genuine, it's not true. And they were in favor of sleek forms and very intentional designs, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. I think there's a lot of beautiful examples of modernism, but unfortunately, it means Deco was swept by the wayside, and during this period, people really hated Deco. A lot of people wanted to tear down a lot of buildings, and unfortunately, they probably succeeded in getting rid of a few of them, but luckily we still have a lot left to appreciate. So how can we bring Deco back? Well, to address the first point of the rising costs, we have incredible new manufacturing processes now like CNC routing and laser cutting and 3D printing. So I could totally see a world where we can get the cost of ornamentation way lower because we have machines to do all this work for us. And next is the changing of taste. You know what they say, history repeats itself. I don't know if it's just me, but I think people are getting tired of the glass boxes. And I really do think that coming back to some form of ornamentation could make for a really unique building that could stand out compared to what we're building today. And we're already seeing some examples of this. In New York especially, there's the Steinway Tower on Billionaire's Row, where of course budget wasn't an issue for them, so they incorporated terracotta panels with an interesting profile and even some brass or bronze detailing in front of the window. It's just excessive details that are not at all related to the function of the building, but they're telling a story of elegance in this case on Billionaire's Row. Another example is Brooklyn Tower in Brooklyn. It's a new super tall building that has this strong vertical emphasis and even like points at the top, clearly inspired by Gothic design, but also influenced by Deco. There's also an incredible startup just outside of New York City that I got the privilege of visiting called Monumental Labs. They're using this massive robotic arm and new software to let robots carve stone that could hopefully make carved stone a viable building material again. In some ways, I feel like I can have an active role in this changing of architectural taste just by shining a spotlight on the beauty that's out there. Through my project, I wanted to capture these buildings in a consistent and unique way to showcase this variety and also create this great catalog of buildings across the entire country, many of which you've probably never seen or heard about before. I decided to photograph just the tops of these buildings because there's this incredible ornamentation way up, hundreds of feet above the sidewalk, that we rarely really get to see. You get to go to the entryway and the base of the building, see it close up, and the middle of the building is just repetitive, so the top is the natural focus. In many ways, these images start to have an analogy to portraiture. One, because it's the head or the crown of these buildings, and two, the consistent composition and lighting, and three, I even add in a slight blur to the background to make sure the building is really popping off the page. Early on, I had the idea for this project and I got really excited about it, but I really wasn't sure how to actually execute it. I considered chartering helicopters to photograph the tops of these buildings, but that sounds like ridiculously expensive, but it would be super fun. I also considered trying to get permission to get on rooftops that were adjacent to these buildings, but the coordination to make that happen sounds like a nightmare. So ultimately, I realized that a drone would be the best way to actually make this happen. So my first step was learning all about drones and airspace, and I got my Part 107 license, which gives me a little bit more flexibility, and it's also something you're required to have if you plan on selling images that you're taking by drone. The next step was really understanding airspace across the USA. This project took an immense amount of coordination with the FAA, getting airspace clearances. I realized right away that there's still one big problem. My drone, a DJI Air 2S, only shoots horizontal images, but I'm photographing these tall, narrow buildings, so clearly a portrait orientation or a vertical image is going to do a much better job. So rather than just taking one image of the building, I actually take several images as the drone ascends the facade. I think of it kind of like a scan, as that bar like moves across a document. It's kind of the same thing my drone's doing. Then I take those images into Photoshop and I manually align them and stitch them together to create one image. You can see though that the background gets all kinds of messed up because you have this changing perspective, changing horizon lines for each of these individual images. So I use the pen tool to just isolate the building, and then I can composite in a different background image that I also shoot on the same day. And even this background image is actually two images, one for the sky and one for the surrounding city. Then comes the really fun part of local editing. So for each of these images, I create a variety of selections, in this case for the gold details, for the window, for the stone. That allows me to have much more fine-tuned control over what this image looks like. And a final step is adding in a little bit of light and shadow, because the image is kind of two-dimensional, so by adding in light, I can show the depth of the building, where it's stepping forward or stepping back. The culmination of this project really is a coffee table book that features 100 of my favorite Art Deco skyscrapers across the country. And it's not just the images. I also worked with a writer named Mark Hauser, and he wrote the incredible stories behind each building. Oftentimes there are these really eccentric characters that were responsible for these really eccentric designs. So far, we've sold 3,000 copies of the book, and I can't help but think the conversations this book can start and the young designers that it could potentially inspire just by sharing these buildings in a new way. I'd love to know what you think in the comments, so let's make it a good discussion. Thanks for watching.